Oh man, I am soaked. I am just drenched already. I did a little survey on Instagram just asking you guys what you wanted to see, what you wanted me to create, and a lot of it was either tips and tricks and tutorials or just everyday vlog stuff. And so I wanted to start off with some tips, a little tutorial on how to do a long exposure. If you've visited my Instagram feed at all, you know that I'm absolutely obsessed with waterfalls, and I really love to do long exposures as well. So I wanted to share that with you guys and show you how to do that as well. And I'm sure you can probably hear that there's a waterfall just behind me. We're at one of my favorite spots here on Maui. And so, yeah, let's jump into it and I'll show you how to do a long exposure. So let's quickly go over some of the settings and the things that you're gonna need for when you're shooting a long exposure. And it comes down to two very important things, and that's stabilization and lighting. And so obviously with stabilization, you want to make sure that you've got something that's going to make sure that your shot, your camera is as steady as possible, as still as possible. So that could be a tripod or a gorilla pod. I've even used, you know, rocks or something to balance it on when I'm in a tight spot or I forgot something. The other part for stabilization is making sure that you put a little timer on your camera so that when you go to take a photo and you're pressing the button, it doesn't shake the camera. So having a timer, whether it's 2 seconds or 5 seconds, will just eliminate any kind of shake that might result from you tapping the camera. Number two is the lighting. And this is the biggest part of shooting a long exposure. All that a long exposure is having your shutter open for just a long time. And so that can vary from a second to 30 seconds. It all depends on the look that you want to get. And so I'll kind of quickly go over the settings that I'm using for this particular shot, but you want to use at least a second or two when it comes to getting those nice creamy waterfalls. The other really important factor when it comes to creating a long exposure, and specifically in lighting, is having an ND filter. We've talked about it before. It's basically just sunglasses for your camera. For me, I use a variable ND filter, meaning that I can kind of change the exposure on the fly just by adjusting the ND filter and kind of turning the little dial that's built into it. And so again, what the ND filter allows you to do is when you have your shutter open for a long time, it's letting in a lot of light. And so to kind of combat that, we're putting the ND filter on so you're still at the proper exposure, but letting that motion blur kind of happen with that nice creamy waterfall. So all together, make sure that you've got your tripod, you've got your shutter speed open for at least a second or two, and you've got your ND filter to combat that extra light that's coming in. For your aperture, your ISO, for me, in this shot in particular, I've got my aperture at f8, and that's just to make sure that everything is in focus. I didn't really need any kind of shallow depth of field for this shot. My ISO is just at its base level, which is 100, because I didn't want any kind of grain. I'm not trying to bump up my exposure because I'm already letting in a ton of light. So just keeping it at its base level, which is 100. So let's see how it looks. Thing to remember is that the settings that I use might not be the settings that you're going to use, just in terms of your shutter speed or your aperture, your ISO. These are just what I use in this particular situation, so make sure you're playing around with all your settings, the exposure triangle, making sure that you've got the right exposure, that your aperture and your ISO, your shutter speed, they're all gonna be put together to make that great shot. So just experiment, make sure, again, that you've got the right that you've got the right exposure settings. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm hoping to be putting out a lot more videos, so make sure to put in the comments below anything that you would like to see, that you'd like me to go over, whether it's tutorials, tips and tricks, travel vlogs, day in the life on Maui. Let me know. I want this to be a community where you have a voice too, that you get to experience what I'm experiencing. It's not just about me. Yeah, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button if you haven't already. It really does help. I'll see you on the next video.